The blinding sandstorms that blanketed southern Iraq clearly hampered some U.S. ground and air operations.
It's a little bit ugly out there today.
But the military was quick to argue the bad weather was having little effect on the overall war plan.
It's been not a terribly comfortable day on the battlefield. However, that hasn't stopped us.
In fact, according to CNN's Walter Rogers, elements of the 7th Cavalry used the cover of sand to outflank Iraqi troops, securing a key bridge across the Euphrates while continuing toward Baghdad. At the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and his top military advisor fended off criticism that 5 days in, the U.S. war plan was suffering from lack of forces and foresight.
I think the plan is finally formulated and is put together by General Franks with some help and some advice, but by General Franks and his commanders, is a brilliant plan. And we've been at it now for less than a week. We're just about to Baghdad.
The Pentagon took particular exception to criticism from some analysts and retired generals that the rapid advancement of U.S. forces has left a vulnerable supply line that stretches about 300 miles to Baghdad.
Leave them too lightly defended, as critics charge.
No, in my view, no.
That's got total dominance of the air.
Yeah,
it is not air superiority, it's dominance. They have not put an airplane up.
But the Fedayeen are chipping away, it seems, at the...
And these are ones and twos, and that you're going to live with, like we live with in Afghanistan. That's where we live with in some major cities in the United States.
There are plans being put in, or plans in place to deal with those onesies and twosies.
Even with the bad weather, the U.S. continued to use satellite-guided bombs to soften up Republican Guard positions. Here, a U.S. Air Force F-15 takes out a Medina Division tank south of Baghdad. And over the last 2 days, U.S. warplanes trumped Iraq's 6 GPS jammers by taking them out with the very satellite-guided bombs they're designed to thwart.
I'm also pleased to say they had no effect on us. In fact, we destroyed one of the GPS jammers with a GPS weapon. Ironic.
U.S. satellite photographs show that Iraqi troops have set large oil trenches afire around Baghdad in what the U.S. says is another futile gesture.
I would say that those oil fires burning are more a hazard to the people living in Baghdad than they are an impediment for us to conduct operations.
In Basra, Iraqi tactics have forced a change in the U.S. strategy to avoid cities. Members of Saddam Hussein's shock troops, the Fedayeen Saddam, are terrorizing the Shia population, preventing anyone from leaving or welcoming coalition troops. So now British forces are moving to take out the regime loyalists and liberate the strategic port city.
Part of the strategy, clearly, is to de-link the regular army, probably the softer of the targets, the irregular forces, and the Ba'ath Party regime, and drive a wedge between that and the people.
So what's going to happen next, Aaron? Well, I want to stress we don't have the war plan, but the way it's unfolding, it looks something like this. It looks like the U.S. will continue to mass troops around Baghdad, moving more forces into the country and up around Baghdad, while at the same time continuing airstrikes for, as I said, days or even weeks to degrade those Republican Guard divisions, both from the ground and from the air, putting tremendous pressure on them all the time, continuing to knock out air defenses, communications, putting more and more pressure with the hope that there'll finally be a collapse of the regime, or if not, by the time U.S. forces go in, they'll have a lot of armor, a lot of firepower, and an overwhelming advantage, and that the Iraqi forces will be demoralized and fairly easy to take out. That's the way it looks at this point.
Jamie, thank you. Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon. We're joined for an hour or so tonight. We're glad to have him by retired General Don Shepard, who's with us. Just quickly on the point that Jamie just made, any substantive disagreement on what he just laid out?
No, not at all. Okay. This is going to be tough slugging from here on. The real questions are the forces too thin, all those forces coming up. Secretary Rumsfeld saying these armchair generals don't know what they're talking about. This is one armchair general that has not criticized the plan.
Well, it does seem 5 days, 6 days, 7 days into it's probably a little early in the game. Nevertheless, that stuff is out there today, and the plan itself was audacious in some respects.
Yeah. It's very clear the plan was to race towards Baghdad, to bypass the cities in the rear, to accept the small skirmishes that go with that. The supply lines are vulnerable, to be able to clean those small skirmishes up with British forces, Marines, and following elements of the forces and secure it later on. I think it's a solid plan.
On this question of supply lines, which sometimes I seem to fixate on, it's a relatively long supply line, 350 miles. As we've all seen, one of the great advantages of the way the war has been reported is we've seen in great detail how complicated the supply effort is. Has anything that's gone on so far, this Basra, any of the rest of it, forced the military to alter the basic plan?
Not the basic plan, but I think we have been surprised at the fierceness of the fighting that's taken place in Nasiriyah and also Basra. We've also been very surprised at the chemical stuff that showed up in Nasiriyah, that far south.
Good to have you with us for however long we hang on to you. We enjoy our conversations with you. We have much more ahead. We'll take you literally to the front lines and much more. Our coverage continues after a short break here on CNN.
Applying for a second mortgage is fast and easy with Ditech.com.
One of the things that we liked about Ditech were the competitive rates and closing costs. In addition, we were able to take a second mortgage, which is very convenient.
If you need cash to consolidate bills or pay off high-interest credit cards, apply now for a second mortgage with a no closing cost option from Ditech.com.
I recommend Ditech to everyone. They're really nice people to work with.
Ditech.com. Call 1-800-71-FIXED.
CNN tomorrow. Find out how long before troops roll into Baghdad. Plus the struggle to reach U.S. POWs. The American Red Cross makes urgent attempts. How the efforts are going. On the next American Morning with Paul Azan. CNN tomorrow, 7 a.m. Eastern.
We just got word that the Iraqi information minister is becoming the familiar voice now. The Iraqi government is expected to hold a news conference at some point reasonably soon. We've also come to know that if they say 10 minutes, it doesn't necessarily mean 10 minutes. It could be an hour. In any case, we're monitoring all of our feeds out of Baghdad now, and when he steps to the podium, we will carry some or all of that depending on what we hear. On we go. In the meantime, again today, there were disturbing hints, and we underscore hints here, that coalition forces may soon face an attack using chemical weapons. Yesterday, the story centered on intelligence regarding enemy intentions. Today, the evidence is somewhat more tangible. Reporting for us, CNN's David Ensor.
The evidence is accumulating that Iraq may be planning to use chemical weapons. Gas masks turning up in abandoned trenches. In Nasiriyah, in a building marked as a hospital, U.S. Marines found weapons, atropine antidote kits, and that was not all.
They found over 3,000 chemical suits and gas masks, as well as a number of Iraqi military uniforms.
The findings are heightening concerns among coalition forces approaching Baghdad since, as the Iraqis should know, U.S. and British forces do not use chemical weapons. U.S. officials say some intelligence indicates a red line may have been drawn around the capital, with Republican Guard units ordered to use chemical weapons once U.S. and allied troops cross it. There is also, intelligence officials say, suggesting Republican Guard units have been issued artillery shells containing chemical agents.
There has been intelligence scraps, who knows how accurate they are, chatter in the system that suggests that the closer that coalition forces get to Baghdad and Tikrit, the greater the likelihood, and that some command and control arrangements have been put in place.
In Baghdad, Deputy Prime Minister Tariq Aziz repeated his government's stand. It does not have any kind of weapons of mass destruction.
When they started to talk about the weapons of mass destruction, we know, and we always knew, that that was fabrication and lies.
Experts say Saddam Hussein's forces will likely try to hold out in Baghdad for as long as possible without using the weapons his government insists it does not have, hoping to build international pressure on the U.S. and Britain to back down.
In that sense, any use of chemical weapons would be counterproductive to Saddam because it would only galvanize international opinion around the United States.
But if the coalition forces cannot be deterred that way, then, says Ken Pollock, all bets may be off.
And he will use chemical warfare to prevent the United States from taking Baghdad and to inflict as many casualties as he can on U.S. forces in hope that that will convince the United States to stop the war.
Gas, gas, gas! But U.S. and allied forces are well equipped and trained against chemical weapons. Without offering details, Joint Chiefs Chairman General Myers says the U.S. does have a plan for a response to chemical weapons attacks if they should come. David Ensor, CNN, Washington.
We'll talk more about this question of chemical weapons, the hunt for them, the evidence that is building, how strong it is, with retired Special Forces Major Kelly McCann in a minute. Take a break, update the day's headlines, and our coverage continues here on CNN.
It's not just a new way of listening to radio. It's a new way of looking at it. Introducing the Delphi XM satellite radio. Its advanced display can browse 100 XM channels by category, song, or artist. Its compact design connects easily to existing home or car stereos. And at under $200, it's a perfect gift. The Delphi XM Skyfi radio. The newest way to get XM satellite radio. For the road, for the home, for under $200.
Hey, you're gonna love this new Quick Rent at National Car Rental. When you get to the airport, they let you choose your own car. Whatever make and model you want.
Whatever color you want.
You can walk right past the counter. And you don't stand in any lines.
All you need is a major credit card and access to the internet. You rent online at nationalcar.com.
They ought to call it quick and easy.
Bypass the counter.
You don't have to stand in line. Choose your own car. Click, click, click on the computer.
It's all about me. Rent, huh?
Choose the rental car company that lets you choose your own car. Quick Rent at nationalcar.com.
You decided. Once again, CNN is #1 for trust and experience. Americans choose CNN as the most credible news source. CNN is the most trusted name in news.
Good evening once again from the CNN Center in Atlanta. I'm Heidi Collins. Here's the news happening at this hour. The Pentagon says as many as 200 Iraqi soldiers were killed in a bloody battle with Allied forces near the holy Shiite city of Najaf. That's about 95 miles south of Baghdad. It is described as possibly the biggest firefight of the war. U.S. Marines in Nasiriyah have taken nearly 170 Iraqi prisoners after capturing a hospital that was being used for military operations. Inside, the Marines say they found a chest containing various weapons, including these AK-47 assault rifles. They also say they found vials of atropine, an antidote against chemical weapons. U.S. officials say coalition forces will face a formidable challenge when they reach the vicinity of Baghdad. They believe Iraq's defenses have been set up in layers around the city, which the coalition is trying to degrade. U.S. officials say Iraq's Republican Guard is the linchpin of those defenses and is also being bombed. An update now on combat casualties. The U.S. reports a total of 14 combat deaths, including friendly fire incidents. The U.K. has suffered 6 combat deaths. Another 14 lives were lost in accidents. And there are 7 American POWs now and several soldiers still missing in action. The family of one U.S. POW says the Army tried twice to rescue him and his co-pilot. The 2 were taken prisoner by Iraq yesterday after their chopper went down south of Baghdad. The family says heavy ground fire prevented other Apaches from making a rescue. U.S. Navy officials say the Navy will bring in trained dolphins this week to look for floating mines in the waters around Qasr. The mammals will mark any mines for Navy divers to inspect. And that is what's happening at this hour. Now back to more comprehensive coverage of the war in Iraq and Aaron Brown.
Heidi, thank you. All the talk about the gee whiz technology, and nothing is more gee whiz, if you will, than seeing these dolphins go after the sea mines.
I know it.
Thank you very much. Kelly McCann joins us. He has been with us before. He does security, he analyzes security matters for us. He's a former Special Forces Major, and we're glad to have him. In and of itself, Kelly, I guess if I were the Iraqi government, I could make the argument that simply because they found a bunch of chemical weapons suits hardly says that we are hiding chemical weapons, because they could be as much defensive as anything.
Undoubtedly their ploy, Aaron. I mean, you know, faced with that, they're going to obviously say that right up until the time, if they do use them, they do. They're going to say that it was for defensive purposes, despite the fact that we know that it's against the law of land warfare.
Well, it's not against the law of land warfare to have chemical weapon suits. It's not...
No, to have the weapons.
Right. No, I
use them.
understand that. So what becomes conclusive evidence? At what point is it a sort of game, set, match point thing?
You know, it's kind of a quantitative answer, isn't it? I mean, what if we found some shells, but not anything that rose to the level that people have stated there undoubtedly is? What if we find some stores, but no production facility? You know, I mean, this is really an unanswered question, and I think there's a lot riding on it. It will be looked at in different senses depending on the region in the world you're from.
In fact, early in the inspections process, I recall, they came up with a number of warheads that were capable of holding chemical weapons, but in and of itself, that doesn't answer the question. Do you suspect that there are some of your old guys, Special Forces guys, prowling around inside Iraq tonight as we talk, looking for stores of chemical weapons?
Yes, there are. About a decade ago or more, it really became another mission area, which was counter weapons of mass destruction proliferation teams. And basically, they're highly trained. They worked with some of the domestic agencies to get up to speed and have really accelerated that kind of learning curve over the last decade. And tremendous equipment, plus they are special operators, so they have a direct action capability, which is a limited raid capability to take matters in their own hands should that target of opportunity present itself. So there is undoubtedly people looking places like Kirkuk, where it could be concealed in an oil separation platform or plant very easily. I mean, these are the kinds of crafty methods that would be used by Saddam's regime.
In a perfect world, and I assume war rarely presents itself in a perfect world, would these special ops guys try and destroy that store of chemical weapons on their own, or would they call someone else in to do it?
I think initially, Aaron, that the primary concern is going to be to present it to the court of world opinion. So I think the destruction would be counterproductive to what's trying to be shown here. So I think that what they'd try to do is isolate it, contain it, then ramp up enough security troops in the area so that we could control it without fear of a counterattack or any kind of intrusion, and then basically show that to the world.
So the idea then is to isolate it, make sure they can't use it, but get the pictures and the, excuse the expression, public relations value out of it when the time comes.
Exactly right, because without that, we're going to be holding a big bag.
It is thank you, Kelly, another example of how media, it seems to me, is playing an odd role in all of this. Kelly McCann, once again, we enjoy very much having you with us tonight. We'll keep an eye on the chemical weapons aspect of the story. There's been no one who's been a better ally of President Bush in all of this for many, many months now than the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Mr. Blair spoke out about the war today. Later in the week, he'll come to Washington and meet with the president. But there are hints of a divide opening up between the two men, not on how to fight the war, but on how to win the peace. Here's CNN's Robin Oakley.
That the regime that they
Tony Blair had a clear message Tuesday for the Iraqi people, whom he said had been failed after the Gulf War in 1991.
They've been let down before, when they thought coalition forces were going to remove Saddam. And my message to them today is that this time we will not let you down. Saddam and his regime will be removed.
On Wednesday, when he flies to see George Bush at Camp David to discuss their progress towards that aim, they'll have plenty to agree on about the war. But Blair wants to focus too on what happens afterwards. And there could be snags. All along in their association, Blair has been pushing the president to take the UN route that proved such an embarrassment for both before the war. In the Azores 10 days ago, Mr. Bush seemed to have been won over again.
If we use military force in the post-Saddam Iraq, the UN will definitely need to have a role. And that way it can begin to get its legs of responsibility back. And it's important for the UN to be able to function well.
But since then, Pentagon officials have indicated they want the UN's role strictly limited to humanitarian aid. Challenged on that by reporters, Mr. Blair made clear he wasn't having it.
But there is no question of the UN role being reserved simply for the humanitarian situation. It is important that whatever administration takes over in Iraq, that has the authority of the UN behind it. I mean, that is going to be important, as I say, for the coalition forces, for the Iraqi people, for the international community.
It's an opinion shared by European Union leaders. They don't agree on much else over Iraq, but at their summit last Friday, their joint statement insisted the UN must continue to play a central role during and after the current crisis. And to underline the point, Mr. Blair is calling not only on Mr. Bush, but on UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan too. There's not a whisker between President and Prime Minister over how they fight the war, but there are tensions between London and Washington over what happens afterwards. On the post-war role of the UN, Mr. Blair, who needs to patch up some friendships on his side of the Atlantic, is siding with the still idealistic Europeans, not with a doubting US. Robin Oakley, CNN, Downing Street, London.
So this question of how to manage post-war Iraq is one thing on the table. When the president meets with Mr. Blair, the president has lots of things on the table these days. His tax bill was up in the Senate today, his tax cut bill. There's a supplemental budget to pay for the war that needs to be considered. Plenty of work for the president and plenty of work for the reporters who cover the White House. Suzanne Malveaux has the duty tonight, and she joins us from there. Good evening to you.
Good evening, Aaron. The president is encouraging Congress to pass that emergency spending bill for the war in 3 weeks. That's before the Easter recess. A couple things to keep in mind with this supplemental. First of all, it only covers the cost of activities for 6 months. And the second aspect is that the full cost will be paid 100% by American taxpayers.
President Bush unveiled his much-awaited cost estimate of the U.S. war with Iraq, nearly $75 billion over a 6-month period.
The wartime supplemental is directly related to winning this war and to securing the peace that will follow this war. I ask Congress to act quickly and responsibly.
The total emergency spending bill is $74.7 billion, $63 billion of that for the prosecution of the war, $8 billion for international operations, relief, and short-term reconstruction, including aid for U.S. allies, and $4 billion for Homeland Security. But the Pentagon cautions this figure could dramatically change.
The budget figure the president announced up there is not the cost of the war. The budget figure he announced up there is the cost of some money the state needs, some money the CIA needs, some money that Homeland Security needs. If you can't tell how long it's going to last, you sure can't tell what it's going to cost.
Unlike the Persian Gulf War, which was paid almost exclusively by U.S. allies, 100% of the cost of this war will be picked up by U.S. taxpayers. But in a clear message to the Bush administration, some in Congress are concerned about how the U.S. will pay for this war. The Senate voted to slash the president's $726 billion tax cut package by more than half.
Mr. Sarbanes. House passed Mr. Bush's version. Probably when it goes into conference, it'll be somewhere in between the figure of $350 and $700+ billion. When it comes to the supplemental, Democrats want more money for Homeland Security. Both sides want more money for their pet projects. So in all likelihood, it will be passed in that 3-week period, probably more than $75 billion. And Aaron, when it comes to the long-term costs of reconstruction, well, Iraqi oil is going to pay for that, as well as those frozen funds from Iraq, the Iraqi regime. Aaron?
Suzanne, 20 seconds on the tax cut bill. The House passed the big one. The Senate looks more inclined to slash it in half. We end up somewhere in the middle?
Somewhere in the middle is likely, between $350, $700+ billion. There are quite a bit of critics who say you cannot afford to conduct this war, to carry out this war, and have such a big tax cut. But you'll probably see the president doesn't expect to get everything he wants out of this, certainly hoping for a figure that's closer to $720 billion, but probably somewhere in the middle. Cut the difference.
Thank you very much. Suzanne Malveaux at the White House tonight. Excuse me, we've talked a lot about how the war has been covered over the last week or so. We'll be looking at that after a break. General Wes Clark is with us again, so we have a long way to go here tonight. We'll take a break first, and our coverage continues in a moment.
The war in Iraq continues, and no one takes you closer than CNN, live throughout the day. Stay with CNN, the most trusted name in news.
No one will ever
just remember your name. No one will instantly make you their hero. No one will automatically give you respect just because you show up. You have to earn it.
Comcast, proud to be the Bay Area's new cable company.
I like bugs. Dead bugs. I collect them. They're no longer living. Sometimes I send them to my friends. I learn everything I can about them. The thorax. These are my little friends. What can I say? I'm very passionate.
Everything we do is about connecting you to the stuff you love most. Comcast.
CNN, the most trusted name in news.
We said General Wes Clark is with us tonight. Every time I say General sits to my left here and he flinches, he thinks we're going to him. And this time, in fact, we are. It's good to have you with us. We started this hour by saying, General, that it appears the Americans have hit Iraqi TV, taken it off the air. All the reporting we're getting out of there is that Iraqi TV is off the air. You can see the smoke that is moving. You know, people have been asking us, what is that building? By the way, it's a bank. It's a small bank building in Baghdad. Anyway, lots of smoke. If you were commanding this war, well, let me ask you differently, because I don't like to put you in the position of second guessing. It's a nice thing at some point to have the other side's communication system taken out, because
well, this is an integral part of his command and control system. We went through the same problem with Slobodan Milosevic, and you may remember after agonizing debate, we finally took out Serb television. Now, of course, they had a way of getting it back on the air. Maybe the Iraqis will too. But this is an important blow at Saddam Hussein's prestige, not only at home and in the Arab world. And this is not only a military campaign, it's a psychological campaign. It's a media campaign. And just as you were saying, Aaron, the media is an important weapon of war here. Those pictures of those Americans that were displayed around the Arab world, they made a lot of people in many different countries over there happy.
But the mere fact that you've taken Iraqi TV off the air doesn't mean that you have eliminated the ability of the Iraqis to get those pictures out, because there's the BBC is there, and Al Jazeera is there, and Lebanon TV and all the rest. It's really how he communicates to his own people that's been damaged.
Well, that's right. I mean, this is one more impediment to him. This is one more element in the friction of war that we're imposing on Saddam.
And you mentioned in the war in the Balkans, where it seemed to me every decision seemed to be a difficult decision, and in conflict, did it change the playing field when you were able to take out TV?
It did in that war, because it was a huge step for NATO to have the resolve to act in a united way against what people consider a dual-purpose target. It had a civilian connotation, right. And you know, it dealt with freedom of the press and other, you know, hallowed Western values, and suddenly we'd struck at it. So it was a major psychological blow to Milosevic. This is not quite the same, because this is a United States decision, and the United States is always prepared to make tough decisions like that. So we did not have the same agonizing decision process, but it is a blow to Saddam Hussein.
Now, if we, that's Baghdad. David, if we can put up the Kuwait picture, we can talk about one of the other major storylines of the day. Go ahead and take it full if you want for a second. This is Kuwait City this morning, now coming up on 7 o'clock in the morning. Obviously, the weather, General, has been a huge part of the story today. We've seen some dramatic, honestly, pictures from the battlefield, and this is a pretty dramatic picture, too. We've looked out on this scene for days and days and days and seen off into the distance. As a practical matter, it is not without implications.
Well, it's made it hard for us to continue our activities in the planned way. I mean, it does slow down the tempo of the strategic move to get the grip on the Republican Guards. And it gives the Republican Guards, if this is the same in the area around where the Medina Division is, a certain amount of cover from air observation. It makes it difficult for us to use our unmanned aerial vehicles against them. Target acquisition is more difficult. Maybe they've got more of a chance to dig in and conceal themselves. But this will be over, and then they'll be on their own again.
It grounded helicopters in Iraq today, and in fact grounded them in place, increasing the risk. Is this part? I don't know enough about the weather here, honestly. Is this part of the reason why they wanted to fight the war a little, or start the war perhaps a little earlier, because you get this sort of unpredictable weather besides the heat that starts to come? Or is this just another day in the region?
I'd say just take it as another day in the region. I mean, you have violent weather in this region, especially during these 3 or 4 months here. You know, we live with it. It's the ups and downs of battle.
Got it. It's nice to have you back with us. I didn't want people to think that you ran and fled, that you couldn't take a full week with me. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
And General Clark be spending the night with us. We talked in every war, I suppose, images matter. In this particular war, it's being played out so literally around the world on TV. We're watching it. Some of it we watch live. We see a battle as a guy in a tank is seeing it in many respects. It's been stunning to watch. And how it will shape public opinion at this point certainly is one of the great mysteries of the war. For us reporting is CNN's Jeff Greenfield.
What's your name?
Shauna. Today, the images that appall us come by satellite, transmitted instantly halfway around the world. But they are, in a sense, only the newest chapters in a very old story. 140 years ago, photographer Matthew Brady's exhibit of photographs of the Civil War dead at Antietam, shown in New York months after the battle, brought home to civilians the real picture of real war. 100 years ago, American newspapers helped lead the country into war with Spain, with these illustrations of the battleship Maine exploding, almost surely an accident, but one that was painted as a hostile attack.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about.
A generation ago, uncensored reporting from Vietnam threw doubt on the official story of the war, with images of burning villages and a street corner execution of an enemy.
And you'll be able to count each bomb. 1, 2.
A dozen years ago, the first Gulf War appeared on our TV screens as something like a bloodless video game, with reporters tightly controlled by a Pentagon determined not to repeat the Vietnam experience. This time, the administration made a deliberate decision to bring the astonishing new technology of the press right up to the front lines, to show America and the world that this was a war of liberation, not of conquest. In doing that, they,
responding with heavy machine gun fire,
and the press have provided striking evidence of the power and the limitations,
and time is very critical here,
of instant media. More than a century ago, futurists imagined a time when people would watch a war live from the comfort of their living rooms. Today, that future has arrived. But this flood of instant information has come with a price. It means that separate images from each day, from each hour, can alter the whole impression of the war. The easy optimism of one moment becomes the pessimism of the next. And the death or capture of a single soldier can become the overwhelming story because we can see their faces, hear their voices.
I was afraid he was dead.
Witness the suffering of families. And if the U.S. government wants the press there to record images that reaffirm the U.S. role as liberators, it will also be there to witness resistance and the inevitable death of innocents. Moreover, in an age when images are recorded and transmitted internationally, there is no way for authorities in a free nation to block such images even if they wanted to. Now, there's also one effect of this flood of information we can't yet measure. It compresses time drastically. In World War II, the first photo of a dead American did not appear until nearly 2 years after Pearl Harbor. And that was a war where the news of the first 6 months was almost all bad. Germans sinking American ships at will, the Japanese sweeping through Asia. This war with Iraq has gone on for 6 days and has already produced a striking mood swing. What will it mean if the country finds itself swinging between emotional highs and lows as every day brings us compelling images that may or may not reflect the wider scope of this effort? Aaron?
Jeff, it is the absolute truth. I've wanted to call you about 4 times over the last several days to talk about this because I'm just curious, as you've watched the reporting, the embedding reporting, has it surprised you how the process has worked at all?
I have to be honest with you and tell you that to some extent, with all of the new amazing technology, it is an old story about what television does, the overwhelming impact of the image over broader issues. Back during the Iran hostage crisis, almost 25 years ago, the focus on the hostages, in effect, held American foreign policy hostage. And you're already beginning to see second-guessing 6 days into a war because we've seen stories of a handful of POWs. But we know them so well. We've already met their families. We know where they went to school. And it's the kind of thing that television has been doing from its inception. So what I think we're seeing, Aaron, is an even greater example of a story that we've been living and struggling with for the better part of 3 or 4 decades.
Jeff, thank you. We've been doing some media panels so far this week. If we have half a brain, we'll make you join one of them. I hope you will.
Be delighted.
Thank you. Jeff Greenfield is in New York. We'll talk with Howard Kurtz, who writes media criticism for the Washington Post in a minute. We need to take a break first. Our coverage continues in a moment.
My grandfather started the business back in 1923. Figured everybody likes ice cream, so that might be a pretty good way to make a living. This is where we mix and prepare the ingredients for the ice cream. Who can guess what we keep in here? That's right. Got to keep it cold in here.
Introducing New America Online 8.0. With hundreds of new features, there's never been a better time to try it.
You've got mail.
With 8.0, I can customize my email.
AOL's new parental controls I can set up for each one of my children.
Now AOL searches are faster than ever with Google. The customer service is free and it's 24 hours a day.
Call now and get 1,025 free hours for 45 days. There's no commitment and you don't even need a credit card.
America Online has so much more.
New AOL 8.0 with hundreds of new features. There's never been a better time to try it.
CNN tomorrow. Find out how long before troops roll into Baghdad. Plus the struggle to reach U.S. POWs. The American Red Cross makes urgent attempts. How the efforts are going. On the next American Morning with Paula Zahn. CNN tomorrow, 7 a.m. Eastern.
Many of you know Howard Kurtz as the host of Reliable Sources here on CNN, which has never stopped him from throwing a punch at us or anybody else that seems to get on his nerves in the world of media criticism. He writes it for the Washington Post as well, and he's someone we respect a lot and glad to have with us again tonight. Welcome.
Thank you.
There's a million questions I suppose we could ask. Do you see a significant difference in the way, in the tone between the way television is reporting this and the way newspapers are reporting this?
Not so much, Aaron, except for the obvious speed that television brings to it. I just want to say at the outset, the embedded reporters on all the networks and for all the major papers are doing a terrific job under very difficult circumstances. It's so vivid you can practically feel the sand in your hair, but with the power of TV, when their military unit comes under attack, when you can hear the shells exploding over their heads, when their units suffer casualties or get involved in friendly fire incidents, that becomes the story. And so I think that both in the morning papers this morning and all over TV the last couple of days, there has been a pessimistic tone because certain units with certain embedded reporters have suffered setbacks or encountered fierce resistance. That may be, in the larger scheme of things, something of a blip.
Well, at the risk of really causing myself trouble, let me beg to differ gently. I was looking at the way the New York Times, a competitor of yours, reported the story. It seems to me that their Times reporters are feeding a lot of information into one reporter to write the story and give a broad overview of the day and then breaking into individual pieces, which I assume is the way the Post is doing it too, isn't it?
Sure, with 30 other stories from reporters around the world. But here's the thing. You began to see in this morning's papers stories that said the second guessing. Is this really going according to plan? How come we're encountering all this fierce resistance? Part of the reason I think for that, and you're hearing that tone on television as well, part of the reason is that in the run-up to this war, the media played a big role here, and Pentagon officials were more than happy to feed the perception that this was an awesome military machine that was going to roll on to Baghdad and all the Iraqis were going to throw flowers. Well, guess what? War is messy, war is difficult, mistakes are made, and there is a lot of resistance that these troops are running into. So I think, just like in a political campaign, the media kind of jacked expectations up. People thought the war would be over in maybe 2.5 hours or 2.5 days, and now that it's turning out not to be the case, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, the press is kind of pulling back and trying to correct or balance some of those earlier, more optimistic predictions.
Let's talk about television for a few minutes and see if you throw a punch or not. Do you think that we as a business, or CNN specifically if you want, but I mean the question more broadly, have sanitized too much the pictures coming back, particularly on the coalition side?
I don't think so. I saw bodies of dead Iraqis when I watched Ted Koppel at ABC. I think that when there has been violence, I mean, without putting on extraordinarily gruesome pictures of people who have been killed, I think we're getting a real feel in our living rooms for what combat is like. Jeff Greenfield made the analogy to Vietnam, but those pictures, that film had to be flown by helicopter and often showed up a couple of days later. We're seeing, I've seen a reporter stick a microphone in the face of a soldier who had just been wounded and was talking to his family back home. So I don't think they're overly sanitizing. I know there's a debate about should we have shown more or less of the POW photos released by Iraqi TV. I don't see a lot of sanitation at this point.
The other night we sat here for 3 hours or so and literally watched and commented on a battle, a small battle, battle's probably not the right word, take place. There was a British reporter there. He would interview the sergeant, and I said several times, for better or for ill, we're able to do this. This is your job. Is it for better or for ill?
I don't think there's any question that it's for better, although that's obviously a mixed bag. Compared to what? Compared to the Gulf War, when we got most of our information from Pentagon briefings, a lot of which turned out to be too optimistic, compared to Afghanistan, where the press was largely shut out from the battlefield. I think that the military has benefited because reporters have been there to humanize the story, to bring us the narrative of fighting men and women.
I'm sorry.
And at the same time, the bad news has come through the screen very vividly.
Just focus on the live component of it for a second, because that's what I'll tell you the truth, that scares the dickens out of me, that we're going to cover one of these things live, and the kind of picture you would never allow on TV simply because you don't need to make the point is going to happen before our eyes on live TV, and we have no editorial control over it.
I think that's inevitably true, that somebody is going to get their head blown off and the camera is going to be there, and there's not going to be anybody in the control room to say, well, no, don't put that on the air. But at the same time, I think that it's hard for people at home to sort out, even today in Basra. Was there an uprising? Was the uprising against Saddam? Was the uprising against the British troops who were trying to control the city? So we're really seeing the journalistic sausage being made. I think over time, people have become sophisticated viewers. They will sort this out. But it does create this kind of roller coaster effect where one day everything seems to be going great, and the next day it seems like the coalition is suffering all kinds of setbacks.
It sure does. Boy, you should sit up here. It sure does. Mr. Kurtz, it's always terrific to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Howard Kurtz, who writes media criticism for the Washington Post. Are we going to a break, or are we going to the update? Okay, we'll go to the update. Heidi Collins has that, and our coverage will continue in a minute or so. Heidi.
Thanks, Aaron. Checking the latest developments now at this hour. The battle at Nasiriyah rages on. U.S. Marines have seized a hospital in the southern Iraqi city and captured nearly 170 Iraqi soldiers. U.S. Central Command says the Iraqis had been staging military operations from the facility. A photo taken by Marines at the hospital and released by the Defense Department showed a chest containing weapons, including AK-47 assault rifles. A second photo showed what military authorities described as containers of atropine. Atropine is used to counteract chemical nerve agents. In another massive battle, this one in the Euphrates Valley east of Najaf, Pentagon officials say coalition forces killed 150 to 200 Iraqis. An initial report said the fighting was between elements of the 7th U.S. Cavalry against Iraqi foot soldiers firing rocket-propelled grenades and other weapons. One of the companies contracted to extinguish oil well fires in Iraq says they should all be out within 240 days. There appear to be far fewer oil wells on fire now than there were during the 1991 Gulf War. Then Iraqi troops retreating from Kuwait set fire to more than 700 wells. In Kuwait, loaded trucks of relief supplies destined for Iraqi residents are ready and waiting. The White House says the massive stockpile can be delivered once the port of Qasr is open and cleared of mines. Meantime, the UN Security Council meets Wednesday to discuss getting aid to Iraq as soon as possible. The Senate has voted to slash President Bush's proposed tax cut by more than half, from $726 billion to $350 billion. 3 Republicans voted with Democrats to reduce the tax cut. Those who voted for the reduction said concerns over war costs and the escalating federal deficit were factors. Continuing coverage of the war in Iraq live from the front lines continues right now with Aaron Brown.
Heidi, thank you very much. Quick look at Baghdad this morning. It's 7 o'clock in the morning in Baghdad, and it is a mess in that city, and a bit of a mess on top of that, apparently on the lens of that camera too, which seems to have lost focus or it's got dust on it. The city, it's a very windy day. There's smoke from the attack, which we now can confirm was on Iraqi TV. Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon. Jamie, let's bring you in quickly. Tell us what you know about the attack.
Well, we have now learned from the U.S. Central Command that, in fact, Iraqi television and is also a key telecommunications facility, as well as Baghdad's satellite communications, have all been targeted both by Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles and by ordnance dropped from the air as well. So a number of precision-guided munitions were used to take out a group of buildings that comprise something that makes up Iraqi television and also satellite communications as well. The stated purpose of this, according to the U.S. Central Command, is simply to take away command and control capabilities from the regime. And again, a senior administration official here in Washington tells CNN that it was always the plan not to take out the television from day one, that it served a purpose for a while, but under the war plan, there's a sequence of events that happens in a specific order to try to create the effect of undermining the regime. And in that sequence, today was the day that Iraqi television was scheduled to be taken out. Aaron?
Jamie, thank you very much. I wonder if we have Nick Robertson for one quick question. Nick, we talked about the Iraqi TV complex. Again, as I recall, there's a school around that complex. There's a number of buildings, the information ministry. Do they have any other options to get their message out to the people of Iraq?
It is possible by bringing up another transmitter somewhere else. I did see something interesting happening right at the Ministry of Information, close to the television station, in the few days before the war began. It appeared that Iraqi engineers were reconfiguring some of their outside broadcast trucks for the television station. They were fitting transmitting antennas to some of those vehicles, perhaps with the intention of having some mobile transmitters or having transmitters that they could move off and transmit the same signal but from somewhere else, obviously without the studio capacity. And also these transmitters that I could see being built were not going to be huge high-power transmitters. There's no way that they could cover the whole city, only certain areas of it, Aaron. So it does seem at this stage, if the signal stays down for the television station, that primary facility is down. But of course, we'll have to wait and see to see if Iraq has anything else that it can bring up and put on the air, Aaron.
Stay with us, General. You weigh in too, as always. The attack was several hours ago. We saw in the night sky one huge explosion. We don't actually think that explosion was the hit on Iraqi TV. It might have been based on where it hit from where the camera was, but there's no question that Iraqi TV was hit. And in fact, we were monitoring Iraqi TV during this time and saw it go off the air. I don't know if we, well, I guess we do. There was an official, a military official, holding some sort of press conference or making some sort of statement, and then Iraqi TV went to black, as we say in the business, came on and off a little bit. And as we are being told by reporters in the region now that it is off the air. It kind of intermittently came back and forth for a while. but now is dead. Doesn't mean it'll stay dead, but it means that's where it is now. And you can see here, General, the aftermath of what those weapons did. Obviously, it seems to me at least, it's so much closer to us in our location than the attacks of not quite a week ago.
Well, not only that, Aaron, but it's probable that this facility was more than a TV station. It's probable this had command and control underneath it, and briefing areas and preparations for, this is a whole public communications strategy center probably. It's probably redundant. So there's probably another set of mobile antennas that they will erect, and they'll probably try to get a weakened signal back out at least once or twice.
Nick, isn't there a Republican Guard building or I think headquarters building in that area also?
Absolutely. The road that runs past the television station had bunkers at either end, machine gun posts, armored personnel carriers in the gates of the television station, and within the compound of the television station, a large military barracks as well. The whole area extended over perhaps about a mile square. Back in 1991, the first few days after the Gulf War started, I was in the television station. There is a bunker system there. I met the then Minister of Information, Latif Jassim, in that bunker system underneath the television station. Difficult for me to assess how far and how extensive it was, but it certainly went down at least one level of stairs down below ground level. It did seem like a very heavily constructed facility, but difficult to know what else there was beyond that. But the television station itself, what has always been since the last Gulf War and even before, a very heavily defended location, and the security was really stepped up there in advance of this current campaign. Aaron?
And Jamie, I'm sorry, Nick, on just one other quick thing on a different matter. We see it's still windy there, and I see you're wearing gloves, so I gather it's pretty chilly this morning in the region as well.
It's been a very cold night through the day here in Jordan, or through yesterday rather. There was heavy snow in the city of Amman. Out here at the border, it's been almost down to 0 degrees, and that's 32 Fahrenheit, if you will, overnight. And it's perhaps getting a little warmer now, but the wind really picking up. And we know not far behind me, perhaps about 70 or 80 miles behind me, U.S. Special Forces control H-2 and H-3 airfields just inside Iraq. And likely it has been an extremely cold night there, exposed in the desert, and the wind's really picking up again with the daylight, Aaron.
And Nick, knowing you, I have a feeling you wish you were there too. Soon enough, my friend. Thank you. Nick Robertson, who's in Jordan, having been expelled from Baghdad by the Iraqi government. We've been struck by the speed with which the American forces got from Kuwait to the outskirts of Baghdad, but also by the downside of doing so, as we saw the war plan play out with 3rd Infantry Divisions charged through southern Iraq. The task of actually holding territory has now fallen on the British and on the Marines in Qusar and in Basra. Further up the Euphrates River as well, there is the city of Nasiriyah, and taking that has not been easy. At about this time last night, that battle was on. CNN's Alessio Vinci is embedded with the Marines and spent a second day watching that fight unfold.
The battle in Nasiriyah between U.S. Marines and Iraqi military continued for a second straight night, and it was the most intense yet. Heavy machine gun fire, mortars and helicopter gunships were all involved in the fight as the U.S. military pushes north towards Baghdad. The fight was so intense and the front lines so fluid that a U.S. Marine unit involved in the battle mistakenly took U.S. forces staged nearby as opposing forces. The Marine was lightly wounded in the shoulder and immediately evacuated, as others frantically tried to identify themselves using chemical lights and special signs. Later in the day, a nasty sandstorm and rain prevented forces on all sides from fighting and allowed the U.S. military to deal with some civilian casualties. Some of them have been flexi-cuffed because U.S. military commanders believe they may be members of a paramilitary group to whom they attribute the stiff resistance against U.S. forces in Nasiriyah. U.S. military commanders here say among Iraqi forces on the other side of the front line are so-called Saddam's Fedayeen paramilitary group. They are a concern to U.S. forces here because one of the tactics of the Fedayeen is to mingle among civilians. And the U.S. Marines here say they want to avoid as much as possible killing civilians.
The commanders have identified that certain civilian vehicles with certain markings and certain colors have been deemed as resupply vehicles. And that's the way these guys work, you know. They'll stage or cache weapons and ammunition out here. So we've been authorized to engage certain civilian vehicles.
Marine commanders say the driver of this truck refused to stop and drove through a checkpoint at high speed, a violation of the current rules of engagement, so they shot at it. They say such vehicles may carry hidden weapons and perhaps even fertilizer, which could be used as an explosive. For now, though, they have been too busy fighting to verify the contents. Alessio Vinci, CNN, with the U.S. Marines in Nasiriyah, Iraq.
One of the things we're going to try and do tonight is take these individual moments, this battle here or this firefight there, and put them in the larger puzzle for you as we go along. Michael Gordon of the New York Times will join us in a moment. General Clark obviously will help us with that. But let me put one more puzzle piece on the table for us. CNN's Jason Bellini has been out with the Marine 15th Expeditionary Unit. That unit has been doing yeoman's work cleaning up after the bigger Army infantry units moved on north. And now his unit, too, is on the move.
The first in to the port of Qusayr are also the first out. The shadowy, civilian-clothed Iraqi fighters who played a game of shoot-and-go-hide with them seem to have lost. So now they're sent deeper into Iraq, to another objective, to another reported hotspot. On the road, they witness a deteriorating country. Villagers wave at them as they pass by. Bombed-out Iraqi military hardware off the road. More detained Iraqis, perhaps civilian, perhaps not. The omnipresent, smiling face of Saddam Hussein greeting them upon their arrival.
iPad, do you have visual on that, over?
Their work begins right away.
We're taking gunfire from them.
Out in the distance, ununiformed Iraqi soldiers again fighting what the Marines consider an unfair fight. Potshots from men in civilian clothing dispersed among the civilian population. The responsive choice is to use missiles, mortars, and bullets, virtually guaranteeing the obliteration of the opponent. Shortly after opening their fire, an ambulance rolls up.
Watch out for this to be a trap!
It's too hard for them to see through their binoculars who's getting in. But the image is a reminder that their weapons have no conscience. Presumed civilians, men, women, and children, wave a white flag to surrender. These are not the gunmen they're looking for. The cat and mouse game is not one Marines like to play.
Where the hell are we going to bring these EPWs?
As hours drag on, frustration overtakes inhibition. So Marines wait for the order to fire once again, knowing no matter how well they kill, in this situation, it's hard for any of them to be heroes. Jason Bellini, CNN, with the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit in southern Iraq.
A couple of the puzzle pieces tonight. Excuse me, Michael Gordon is the chief military writer for the New York Times, and he's been joining us for the last couple of nights, much to our benefit, and he joins us again from Camp Doha tonight. Michael, good to have you. What's your lead in the paper tomorrow?
Well, I think there are really two important things that are going on. I believe that the presence of these paramilitary forces, or Fedayeen, or whatever one wants to call them in the South, really became such a disruptive factor, such a threat to supply lines, and so a mechanism for the regime to maintain control over the population, that it just reached a point where the military had to focus more of its energy on this. And so what's happened is there's a shifting of emphasis in the land campaign toward this threat in the south and in the rear area. There have been a number of battles in Najaf, Nasiriyah, capture there, and then the British around Basra. So I think there's much more activity in terms of the land war in the south now, and I think the Baghdad campaign is going to have to wait a little bit while the American and British forces take care of this problem in their rear area.
I don't know if you heard Secretary Rumsfeld and Chairman Myers briefing today or read the transcript, but they were very dismissive of this stuff in the South. It's onesies and twosies, and it's just something you have to live with. You make it sound like it's far more significant than that.
Well, it is far more significant of that. I didn't listen that carefully to the Pentagon briefing, but if that's what they said, I guess that's the difference between spin control and the reality on the battlefield. I mean, everybody, all the embeds, everyone who's out among the units and the military itself believes that these forces were indeed a menace, and I mean, they were a threat to supply lines, to log bases, and there was another important factor. What we really haven't seen in this war, we're just beginning to see it now in Basra. It was an uprising by the people in southern Iraq, and that's because they felt intimidated by these various paramilitary units that were inserted in their cities, because the Allied strategy heretofore, up to now, really, has been to bypass these cities on the way to Baghdad. So the Americans and British were not going into these cities. The paramilitary units were in these cities. Saddam Hussein was on the television asserting he was in control and winning the war, and these people were pretty much boxed in. And I think what's changing now, and I think this is an extremely important development, is now the Americans and the British are signaling their intention to take the fight to these paramilitary units in the cities in the south. We're really looking at the prospect of urban warfare in Najaf and Nasiriyah, which has actually been going on for a little bit in Basra, so that these units are dislodged. And at the same time, and I think this is related, there's been a cruise missile strike on Iraqi television, which has the effect of knocking Saddam Hussein off the air. And I think that's also important because that also disrupts his regime's effort to maintain control over this population in the south. So I think these two twin developments are intended to help the American and British forces regain more control over this area, also help encourage a rebellion in the area by the Shiite population. And once that area is more secure and the military feels better about moving their supply lines through it and operating in it, they'll be ready to return to the Baghdad fight in earnest.
So I think it was last night I said, you have the feeling that we're coming up on a major moment, and you said, well, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. I gather then that soon is out there somewhere, but not in the next couple of days?
Well, I don't know the timing of all this, and, you know, if I did, I really couldn't say under the way this embed system works.
I understand.
But I think that, you know, they have a saying in the military, which I think is not a bad one, which is that you fight the enemy and you don't fight the plan. I mean, all plans, all human plans, never work out exactly as they're intended to. That's why they're plans. And in this case, the presence of these Fedayeen forces in the south really was unexpected, whatever they say in Washington. It really was a thorn, more than a thorn on their side. It was a danger to the forces, and they felt compelled, and I think it was the correct decision to focus their energy and do something about it. Now, this doesn't mean, I actually think it doesn't hurt the overall effort, because it's not as if the Republican Guard are living some charmed existence around Baghdad. They're now being bombed from the air by airstrikes. So, you know, if you put off the ground assault on the Republican Guard, that's just that much more time to begin to work them over from the air. It also gives you more time to get some of your own forces ready, you know, this under this concept of beginning the fight before all your forces are in the theater. There's still units that are getting ready for this fight in Baghdad. So I don't think a delay of a few days or however long it takes, to my mind, is not a big factor in the scheme of things. And there is this other consideration. The weather here is just absolutely horrible.
Yeah.
I'm sitting outside now in a concrete block in the middle of a sandstorm. It's just not the right conditions to launch into a big ground attack at this time anyway. So I think the headline really is shift the focus in the ground attack to the south. The air is continuing to focus on the Republican Guard in the North. And, you know, it's an adaptation, and I think really a necessary one. And personally, I think the television, based on what I had seen of Iraqi television with Saddam Hussein presenting propaganda to his people and showing off the Apache helicopter and claiming a farmer shut it down and trying to persuade his own public that he was really in charge, but we're trying to send the exact opposite message, I think was an appropriate target.
Michael, as always, I look forward to reading the rest of the article in the morning. Michael Gordon, the chief military affairs writer for the New York Times, and again, we benefit enormously by having him with him. A number of issues were raised there. General Clark is chomping to get at them. We need to take a break first, and we'll continue in a moment.
The country is pretty evenly divided about this war, as they were with the election results, although the majority did not vote for Mr. Bush. And at least at the beginning of this thing, before we went into the war, the majority really weren't that anxious to go to war.
Well, that's that's absolutely true, but that did seem to change over the last week. Are you at all, I mean, are you at all troubled? Look, you stood up there and do it. I guess the answer is self-evident. But on the same day, you said that perhaps 7 Americans were killed in a very bloody fight. 5 were taken prisoner of war. It was a nasty, nasty day, and I think that seemed to play into the moment in how you were received.
Yeah, I think that I guess I wanted to make sure that no more young Americans die in that war, and you know, that day began for me. I went to Mass that day at the church there in Los Angeles before I went to the Oscars, and you know, I was raised with a certain belief system that said that killing was wrong unless it was in self-defense. Killing is wrong, and there aren't many people, I think, in this country that believe that Saddam Hussein is going to kill them this week or this month, and that's the only reason or right you have to perform an act of violence like the one we're involved in now. And I'm opposed to it, and my film is about that. I thought it was a very appropriate thing to say, because my film is about the American culture of violence, both at home and abroad, and you know, how a government, in the name of Mr. Bush in this case, and I put this right in my film, how he has manipulated the people with fear and to get them to back his agenda. And so for me, it was the appropriate thing to do. And frankly, you know, I'm not, look, I mean, you know me, I'm not the kind of guy that's going to stand up there and thank his agent and his lawyer and his agent's lawyer and the guy who gave him the wardrobe. And you know, I mean, you know what I'm saying? I'm just me.
And you're right. I do know you and have for a while, and I know you are who you are, and I wasn't surprised in the least. But I wonder if, in retrospect, you wish you had said it or done it differently.
Yeah. I wish I'd said that that the children of Columbine and all the other Columbines in this country tonight, they've learned an important lesson this week, which is that we adults have taught them that violence is an acceptable method to resolve a conflict. That's the sad, sad lesson that's been taught to our children through this war, and I wish I'd had a chance to say that, but no, look, I was very appreciative of you know, the standing ovation there, and the booing that started was way up in the balcony, and then the people supporting what I was saying started booing them, and then it just turned into a cacophony of people fighting with each other in the audience. I didn't really mean for that to happen. I just felt that that was the right thing to do, and I'm a person of conscience, and I hope all people are that.
The last couple of days since, has it been a sort of predictable people, you've gotten this sort of predictable mail and predictable pats on the back from people who agree with you? Are you at all surprised with the way people have reacted? Or has so much news gone on that what Michael Moore said at the Academy Awards turns out not to be a very big deal in the end anyway?
Well, so I think one of your producers told me that that on the internet in the last 24 hours, after the Iraq War, Michael Moore was the most trafficked name or whatever on the internet. So, unfortunately, I think it has, you know, a lot of people have. I've had about 20 million hits on my website. Incredible mail supporting me. Coming back yesterday, traveling, people stopping me in the airports, thanking me. You know, Aaron, my whole thing for the last 13 years since Roger and me is to attempt to be a voice for all of us who don't have a voice, and a lot of people are grateful that I said the things I said that had to be said, and you know, I realize some people don't agree with it, but that's what's great about this country, that we have freedom of speech, and you know, and I said what I had to say.
Michael, as you said, we've known each other a long time. There's nothing political in this. Congratulations on the Academy Award. That's a wonderful achievement, and we look forward to talking to you again as this goes on, and hopefully it doesn't go on for very long. Michael Moore.
Well, I do hope that, and I hope that all of our young men and women come home safely, and thanks for letting me be the first non-general on here for the last few days.
Michael, I'm not having a conversation about media with you tonight, but I promise you,
tonight, no.
If you want to talk about,
I would love to come back and have that.
Michael, I'm looking forward to it. We haven't had a good fight in a while. Thank you, and I'll be more than happy to defend how we've managed all of this. Michael, thanks a lot. Michael Moore, in a moment. General, you got anything on your mind as we talked about that?
Well, first of all, I was at a media conference today at this little college in South Carolina, and
this job isn't busy enough for
people were asking about what about dissent, and people in the armed forces not only respect dissent, they expect dissent, as long as it's directed at the policies, not the people. You said it last night. You know, we think the American Armed Forces should be respected, admired, appreciated for what they're doing. These are men and women who raise their right hand to lay their life on the line for this country. They didn't make the policy. So as long as the dissent goes after the policy and the policymakers, that's appropriate, that's democratic, and let's have it out.
I will say this about Michael, and I know you upset a lot of people. I think he made it clear that it is policy and not people that he's upset with, and
absolutely.
And you could still think he's a jerk if you think he's a jerk, but he did make that much clear. Are we going to break here? Okay, that's what we're going to do. We'll take a break, and our coverage continues here on CNN.
CNN Tomorrow, General Peter Pace, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, plus families of soldiers missing in action. Only on Larry King Live, CNN Tomorrow, 9 Eastern.
Announcing a technologic breakthrough that could forever change the way you see. It's called LiDAR Vision and features advanced radar eye tracking developed by NASA. Whether you're nearsighted, farsighted, or have astigmatism, come and discover LiDAR Vision by Dr. Gary Kawish, now available.
The dominant factor in the war against Iraq today.
It's like being in a blizzard, except unfortunately the sand doesn't melt as the snow does.
Overall, here's what the landscape looks like tonight. Coalition ground units continue to make a broad sweep towards Baghdad. Elements of the Army's 3rd Infantry Division are 50 miles to the south and west of the Iraqi capital, and late today were engaged in a major battle with Iraqi units south of the city of Karbala. The British, meantime, are encircling Iraq's 2nd largest city, Basra.
In the 5 days since military action began, a huge amount has already been achieved.
Inside Basra, there were the smallest of hints that an uprising may have begun against Saddam Hussein. These pictures of a single gunman firing into the air and destroying a picture of Saddam are certainly not definitive proof. They are a hint, that's all. But British officials say at least it is a positive sign. Meantime, Iraqi television broadcasts these pictures of a coalition drone aircraft shot down and then paraded through the streets of Basra. No firm proof of chemical weapons was found today, but as far as the coalition was concerned, there were hints. Marines seized a hospital in the battered city of Nasiriyah and said they seized thousands of chemical weapons suits as well as conventional weapons. And finally, the southernmost Iraqi city of Qasr was declared under coalition control, finally, and the Navy actually brought in dolphins to help detect underwater mines.
So that's a broad view of the day. We can now focus in on some of the specific moments of the day. The weather was a huge problem. Those of you who have been with us over the course of the last week have spent a lot of time with the cavalry and our correspondent Walt Rogers as he and they made their way from the Kuwaiti border up towards Baghdad. It's gotten a bit messy for them. It appears, based on the reports that we heard today, as they were making their way towards the fighting that went on near Karbala. Walt was able to file this report.
What we're showing you is the convoy in which we're riding, heading north again in the general direction of north in a very strong sandstorm. It's like being in a blizzard, except unfortunately the sand doesn't melt as the snow does. Now, this gives some temporary military advantage to both sides, although the greater military advantage falls to the Iraqis. We have been under heavy fire for the past couple miles, mostly a small arms fire, but the sandstorm has enabled the Iraqis to come very close to the road. And if I sound a little nervous, it's because we're in a soft-skinned vehicle and everybody else is in armor. The 7th Cavalry literally had to run something of a night ambush on both sides of the road last night, crossing one of the canal bridges that preceded the Euphrates River. And that fight was, as I say, more than significant. There were machine gun tracer bullets going out on either side of the road. Every Bradley, every tank was firing. Imagine looking out into total darkness in an agricultural area. You can't see, more than 40 or 50 meters without night vision goggles. And you know there are people out there. We had no idea how many people were out there, but it turned out to be several hundred, 300-400 Iraqi dismounts. The U.S. Army 7th Cavalry has just taken 3 Iraqi prisoners of war. Actually, they're very close, that is to say, no more than 40 yards away. But the dust and sand are blowing so badly, you're getting these vague images. They were captured by the U.S. Army up the road, not very far ahead of us. They were driving a truckload of weapons, and that's when the Army apprehended them. They've had their arms tied. They're lying in the sand now. No evidence of any hostility on their part now, but the only mistreatment is that which we all suffer, which is to say an abuse of Mother Nature by a sandstorm.
Was coming.
Okay, Greta, let's jump to the screenwriter, and I'll lay it out quickly. A lot of the embeds have talked to us about it. Up to the north, you heard about the airborne drop up here around Suleimania at the airbase airport just 10 miles west. The big battle, of course, is shaping up right here down around Najaf, and the key thing is it's the culmination phase. Everything we're doing here is going to shape up there, which we'll probably discuss a little bit. And then finally down around Basra, yesterday the 1st Armored Division, the 7th Armored Brigade, the Red Devils, went in there, and that's very important. I have a couple assets I want to talk to you about. You talked about the B-2, and this manifests itself in the precision strike throughout this whole area that is going on right now, but they're Navy airplanes, Air Force airplanes, etc. Very important to the success of this campaign. And then, of course, this Joint STARS, this Joint Strategic Surveillance Targeting and Attack Radar System, which maps anything moving on the ground or anything static, that's part of our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets that gives a picture to the people on the ground as well as to the people in the air. Quickly, I think the significant thing going on in Basra is there's a convoy of 120 vehicles trying to get out of Basra, which is very significant because I think today, as daylight comes up, we'll see how many people are going to stay there to defend Basra. That's very important. It may be that they're starting to leak out right now, and that'll be the model in the final analysis for Baghdad. We'll learn a lot there. As I said, the big battle shaping up is right here at Najaf and the Karbala Gap here. The Marines are coming up over here at El Kut, and the defenses are the Hammurabi Division, excuse me, the Medina Division with the Baghdad Division just to the east of it, and Hammurabi is sitting back up here. So those divisions, we are in the process of destroying them or taking them down to about 50 to 60% before the ground action transpires. And that will be done it was done yesterday and over the next 48 hours. And then I think you're going to see the culmination phase, the great battle for Baghdad.
All right, General, thanks. General Scales, you're an Army man. Let's talk about these ground troops. It seems to me that the Republican Guard is now coming out of the Baghdad area. They're leaving the sanctity or the safety of the city. Does that make it easier for our guys on the ground?
Greta, that's what you want to happen. You may remember in 1991 the famous Battle of Khafji, where the Iraqi 13th Corps decided to line up their vehicles just north of the Saudi border and attempt to conduct a Corps-sized raid into Saudi Arabia, and they were massacred. You know, the Iraqis are most vulnerable when they mass and when they mass in the open, because that's where our strength comes to play.
Why would they do that? Didn't they learn it first time around? I mean, it seems like if they're moving, and I mean, I realize that, you know, we're getting so much information, and I even know that J-Stars can pick up virtually anything moving, but we think it's about 1,000 Republican Guards leaving back.
I think there are a couple of reasons. Number one is I honestly believe that they thought that sandstorm that was coming in somehow would mask them from Allied air power. Totally erroneous. As Tom said, you have J-Stars that can track them. Secondly, obviously they were sent down that road almost as a sort of sacrificial unit by someone in Baghdad. Remember what they're trying to do here. They'll sacrifice their soldiers to buy time. If it's 1,000 vehicles and 3,000 soldiers, that's fine if that buys them a couple of days. The regime wants to hang on for as long as they can, and if it means sacrificing the Republican Guard to do it, they'll be perfectly happy to oblige.
Captain, your thoughts on it? I mean, it seems, I'm surprised that the Republican Guard at least is coming down to meet our infantry division.
It sounds to me like General Scales has his thumb right on it, and that is they're trying to buy time, and they have seen our television, they have their own intelligence, and they see this massive sweep out to the southwest, and this battle, these battles going up with the Marines and the Brits as they come up the northeastern side of the Tigris, and they probably thought there was a vulnerability there if they could punch down and interdict those supply lines in some significant way.
It's hard for me to think that, because if I were in the Republican Guard, I'd worry that I'd run into someone like you. I mean, you used to fly fighter planes, and the minute the sandstorm stops, the minute we're outside Baghdad and we don't have the protection of the city, all of a sudden you show up in one of your fighter planes, and then I've got a big problem.
You're right, and they have grossly miscalculated once again. Those vehicles are lost right now. They are living on borrowed time. And speaking of time, it's interesting to hear your previous guests and everyone talking about time and how this may take longer than we thought. You know, it may be 3 weeks longer. Oh, so it'll be a 1-month war. You know, we have a sandstorm for 2 days, and all of a sudden the gloom and doom surfaces again. This operation is 1 week and 45 minutes into its existence. And so far, I think the progress has been pretty remarkable. I'm willing to bet right now those 1,000 vehicles, they're toast.
And in terms of the progress, I mean, it's been extraordinary, and the weather has not been on our side only for a small period of time, 24 hours. But this battle for Baghdad, I mean, that's not an insignificant. I mean, we're all sort of sitting waiting for that one.
That's the main show.
That's the main show.
That's the main show. And quite frankly, that's why we took the calculated move, and I won't call it risk, although there's some risk to it, but we took that calculated decision early on to sweep those forces up the flank, up the outside, to get to Baghdad and not crawl through the fighting of the Mesopotamia, but to sweep up, because what's going to determine when this thing is over is when Baghdad falls. And when that occurs, the sooner that happens, the less casualties there will be on both sides. And it was a bold and it was a daring move, and I think that when we look back on this, everybody's going to be glad that we did it.
General Scales, so what's left in Baghdad, do you think? I mean, it seems to me that Saddam's not that stupid that he's going to send everybody out of Baghdad.
Well, no, he's not going to do that. I mean, he's in Baghdad. You know, there's an expression in the military we use called center of gravity and culminating point. Center of gravity is that point that if you strike it with a single blow, the rest of the defense will fall apart like a house of cards. Culminating point is the high point of the battle. That's the point at which you decide the whole issue. And you have both of those nesting in Baghdad. You've got Saddam hiding away in Baghdad with all of his leadership.
In a deep bunker, no doubt.
In some 100-foot deep bunker.
That he's been building for 12 years.
Right. He's surrounded by all that thuggery, but the thing that's going to make the difference are those Republican Guard units. When you break those and they start streaming into Baghdad with nothing on but their boots, that's when this battle's going to culminate.
All right, gentlemen, stand by for a moment. It's time to find out what's coming up in the next hour, and for that we go to the one and only Shepard Smith in New York. Shep.
Greta, thank you. There are lots of breaking details coming tonight. The troops are certainly now in the north. Paratroopers, more than 1,000 of them. Think of that number of people parachuting in to form the northern front. Additionally, there is news tonight for the first time, absolutely confirmed from the highest places, that in fact the Iraqis are executing our prisoners of war, our American troops executed by the Iraqis. We'll talk about the source on that and where it's coming from. Additionally, we'll talk about how this war is going to date, the number of strikes in Baghdad today. We'll speak in depth with our correspondent Rick Leventhal, who's live in the desert. We'll go to Brett Baer for breaking details at the Pentagon, and we'll try to make sense of this. From the front page, as was discussed a moment ago on your program, Greta, from the online edition of the Washington Post, from a respected reporter named Tom Ricks, this war could last months. Tonight we'll talk about his reasons for that, what may have gone wrong, what may have gone right, and sort it all out for you on late night coverage for the East Coast, prime time on the West. That's coming up just 11 minutes from now. Greta, see you then.
All right, Shepard, you know I'll be watching. All right, we're going to go to the USS Constellation, where Kevin Monahan is standing by. Kevin, what's going on in Constellation?
Hi, Greta. Well, the sun has just come up here. It's been a very, very long night of flight operations again. The weather was a problem yet again tonight, but not nearly as bad as yesterday. High wind, some driving rain. They continue to fly through the night here. They're still flying now. Some of the targets that they've been going after, APCs, armored personnel carriers, and tanks in the south of Baghdad area. They've also been going after air defenses and Special Republican Guard units in Baghdad. 24 hours ago, they were pretty happy that they said they got a high-value target, command and control target in Baghdad. So they are still flying quite a bit here, although the weather hasn't been working for them. They've been doing pretty well. Now, as an example of how the air war is evolving, Greta, the new weapon that I've been hearing a lot of, it's not a new weapon, but the weapon I've been hearing a lot of the last couple of days are JSOWs, which are standoff weapons. What they're doing is a lot of the pilots are getting up in the air and they're dropping these JSOWs, which are GPS-guided, sophisticated weapons. But what they can do is they can communicate with people on the ground. People can give them coordinates, ground troops specifically, and they can launch these missiles from about 20 miles plus away. And through the GPS system, hit their targets, hit their coordinates. It helps them in a couple ways. It helps them because they can stay above and out of the fray and out of danger, of course. But the other thing is, it's very good. Yesterday, Greta, you were talking about the fact that laser-guided missiles don't work very well in this weather for obvious reasons. In this case, the GPS-guided missiles, especially the JSOWs, are pretty effective because all they need is a coordinate on the ground for them to hit it. So, Greta, what I find most interesting about this is the crews, the pilots are being asked to be quicker. They're asking to respond more, as opposed to being asked to hit fixed targets, which they still need to hit. They're being asked by troops on the ground. When they need help, they call up. They're able to get off the carrier and hit them with these JSOWs, and so far, it's been pretty effective, Greta.
All right, Kevin, thank you very much for joining us from the Constellation aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf. And I might add that whooshing noise, Captain Nash just told me, was a plane trapping on the deck of the Constellation. Tonight, there's word out of Iraq that a new breed of Iraqi guerrillas may push the Pentagon to change its strategy. Joining us is national security reporter Bill Gertz of the Washington Times. Bill, the Fedayeen, they're giving us more trouble than we anticipated, aren't they?
That's their objective. They are trying to distract the advancing forces and make them look backward instead of in downtown Baghdad. And the estimates are that there are anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000, up to as many as 30,000 of these Fedayeen Saddam, which could also include some of the Special Republican Guard forces as well.
Who are they, Bill? I mean, where did Saddam find this corps of fighters?
Well, you know, the Pentagon had a real hard time today. The military was describing them as irregulars, and Victoria Clark, the spokeswoman, was calling them thugs. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in between. In fact, the intelligence reports of the Battle of Najaf also referred to them as technicals, which is a term we haven't heard since Somalia, when bands of guerrillas were running around in pickup trucks with machine guns. So that kind of gives you a flavor of the type of activity. These are hardened Islamic Saddam loyalists who are out to not only go after the coalition forces, but also the Iraqi population, or any part of the Iraqi population or the Iraqi troops that they regard as disloyal.
All right, Bill, your day job at the Washington Times, you got a story tomorrow, a tragic story that you're going to be breaking, be hitting the streets in the Washington Times very soon. Can you tell us what it is tonight? Sure.
Yeah, it is a tragic story. Our reporter, Joe Edens, is embedded with a Marine unit, and he came across a scene where two Marines were ordered to cross the Saddam Canal, which is parallel to the Euphrates River, and in full equipment and with their rifles, and they got swept under and lost. They're now considered missing and presumed drowned, and they're having a big search to try and find them. And I assume that so far, I mean, the names have been kept. Then there's been no notification or anything, right? Yes. No, they've released the names. Yeah. All right. Well, I think I'll still let the family still keep that one quiet. Somebody else can talk about it, not me. Bill, thank you. Thank you. Let's bring back in retired Air Force Lieutenant General Tom McInerney, retired Navy Captain Chuck Nash, and retired Army Major General Bob Scales. Welcome back to the General McInerney. In terms of the Northern Front, we have paratroopers that have jumped in, but how long before we can get a lot of boots on the ground there to really help the military that's coming up from the south?
Well, it's going to take a little bit of time, Greta, but let's take a look. The Northern Front is going to be much like Afghanistan, with Special Operations Forces and light infantry. And we learned a lot from that. But up here, where this area is, that is not going to be the real key point. The real key point and the culmination of battle, or the center of gravity, is right here. The Northern Alliance is primarily for gaining control of Mosul and Kirkuk, stabilizing it, make sure we don't have a problem with the Kurds and the Turks. This is the battle, though, down here at Baghdad. Medina and Baghdad divisions, those are the key divisions. As I said, in the next 36 to 48 hours, we have to destroy them. And then I'll tell you, all the other writers, Tom Ricks and everybody else, that are hunting for a good story, the story's going to be over.
Well, I guess we'll figure out that when we get to that point. General Scales, any sign to you that the Iraqi military is well organized to suggest that Saddam or somebody else still has command and control? Is there any sign of chaos,
no.
or is there order?
It's one of these stories where there's obviously a score, but there's no conductor and there's no orchestra.
What makes you say that?
Well, because none of this is coordinated. It's all going off at different times. For instance, there's no concentrated attack by artillery and mortars. It's 2 rounds here, 3 rounds there. There are no formations attacking. It's just someone sends a column out on a road and says go south. There's no evidence of any attempt, even among the guerrillas, to coordinate what they do to achieve maximum effect. And that's why so many of them are dying, because there's no combined arms, there's no effort at control, there's no effort to put any type of rigor in what they're doing. And when that happens, if you're in an armored formation and these Fedayeen attack, then you got the opportunity to take them out one by one. If this were an orchestrated defense, it would look a lot different. Now, that's not to say that the defense by the Republican Guard will be disorganized. I suspect we're going to see a heck of a lot more coherence in that defense than we've seen so far.
You shake your head yes, Captain Nash.
And that's because they're more closely aligned. They're in tight around Baghdad.
But someone's still got to run them.
Somebody still has to run them.
Someone's going to be in charge.
But the fact is that if you're taking fire over here and the people right next to you, they're literally within earshot, and it's a lot easier to coordinate when everybody's together. What we're seeing down south are these disparate groups that are spread around. They have not launched one aircraft to
Which is
date.
interesting.
If this was
in fact, let me ask you that about General McInerney. You're talking about aircraft. You've been up in those planes. It is extraordinary. They haven't fought back at any of our planes, it seems like.
the Air Force copped out and they want to be part of the new democratic Iraq. And I'm not laughing. They literally did. And the reason is they knew if they took off they were going to die. Now the Fedayeen Saddam, they are really thugs, terrorists, and they're, as Bob Scale said, Greta, they're going to be cannon fodder because they're committing them piecemeal, and what they're trying to do is protract this. Now, we have the time schedule, and I do believe they're ahead of schedule, but the president likes to lower expectations, and I think that's very important. But clearly, this is coming up, and this culmination phase is going to come very quickly.
All right, and with that, we got 10 seconds left. Captain Nash, you heard the plane land on the Constellation. Jealous? Wish you were there? Old times?
You betcha.
I figured all you guys always say that. Well, serious times, I shouldn't be laughing, but serious times, big job. Gentlemen, thank you very much. And a special thanks, of course, to our troops overseas and also to their families who are here at home. And you keep your TV locked on Fox News Channel for late-breaking updates on Operation Iraqi Freedom. I'll see you right back here tomorrow night. But don't go away. Shepard Smith is here, and he's next.
Looking live, the Pentagon, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying Iraq has executed prisoners of war. Tonight, the Iraqi war crimes, how to deal with them, and what the future may hold. You are looking live. Baghdad, the Iraqi capital, struck again. New explosions and anti-aircraft fire heard this evening. More explosions in the north. America's 3rd Infantry now said to be less than 50 miles from the city. This as Central Command says it sees Iraqi Republican Guard units repositioning, possibly getting ready for the Battle of Baghdad. Convoys of humanitarian aid barrel into Qasr. Iraqi citizens cheering and swarming the troops as they hand out much-needed food and water. Britain's Prime Minister arrives in the United States, Tony Blair, to meet with President Bush in a war council on Operation Iraqi Freedom. All the latest and in-depth analysis on a special edition of Fox News right now. It's 8 p.m. on the West Coast, 11 p.m. on the East Coast, 7 a.m. in Baghdad. I'm Shepard Smith in New York. This is Fox News live coverage of America at war. Nobody ever said this thing would be fast. In fact, they've been using words lately, the president saying we're closer to the beginning than the end. We've heard a lot about the word 1 month. Tonight on the front page of WashingtonPost.com from a respected journalist named Thomas Ricks, the following. Despite the rapid advance of Army and Marine forces across Iraq over the past week, some senior U.S. military officers are now convinced, mind you, that war is likely to last months and will require considerably more combat power than is now on hand there and in Kuwait. That from senior defense officials today. From the cover of the WashingtonPost.com, we'll discuss it in depth with our Pentagon correspondent. We'll go live to the Iraqi desert with our correspondent Rick Leventhal, who's been in the middle of it all, and he'll take your questions to Fox Report at foxnews.com. But let's get it started with the worst news imaginable. For the first time, it is now confirmed the Iraqis are executing captured coalition forces. This from the Pentagon's #2 general, saying tonight that the Iraqis have executed U.S. prisoners of war. This on a night when U.S. paratroopers drop into Kurdish territory, proceeding on foot, 1,000 paratroopers dropping from the sky, the most in decades. The northern option is now available, the Northern Front. is now over. We have Team Fox coverage of the war in Iraq. Jonathan Hunt live in Kuwait City. Greg Palcott live in Amman, Jordan. Wendell Goler live at the White House. But kicking off our West Coast primetime tonight, Bret Baier live at the Pentagon. Bret?
Shep, let's start with the Northern Front tonight. Open in full force, 1,000 paratroopers from the 173rd Airborne Division based in Vicenza, Italy, jumped into northern Iraq tonight. They jumped in and secured an airfield. Right now, it's what they call a jump and carry operation, but they will be bringing in heavy vehicles soon. Now, this is the first regular Army unit in the north, adding to the Special Forces teams that have been there working with Kurdish rebels. Meantime, ground reports indicate significant Iraqi Republican Guard forces are on the move, repositioning, preparing for battles to come. This is some video of Iraqi forces in the south, and while there are expected battles to come with significant divisions of the Iraqi Republican Guard, so far most of the attacks have been guerrilla-type attacks from these irregular troops, the Fedayeen Saddam.
I don't know what the best description of that force is. Almost like a state secret police. In a way, they're enforcers. They do not follow the laws of armed conflict. In fact, they violate most of them. As you may recall, there were some found inside a hospital. That was their headquarters. They don't wear uniforms. They've used surrender flags to try to trick people into thinking they're surrendering, then ambush them. So they are there to enforce regime control over the people in those places where they are, and basically with a gun in their back to keep them loyal to the regime. And they're being dealt with as we find them.
Coalition forces are now carefully covering their supply and communication lines, going building to building in the south, searching for those Iraqi fighters, the Fedayeen, who have been sporadically attacking, finding weapons caches along the way. At one point today, children led troops into a primary school filled with weapons and grenades. You know, we've been talking about it. Pentagon officials said it today. Some Iraqi forces are now dressing in U.S. uniforms to commit acts against their own people and to possibly attack U.S. forces, and now evidence from the battlefield.
In a bunker that had been abandoned by some of the Fedayeen, they found uniforms, actual uniforms of the 3rd Infantry Division. They actually had markings and they had American name tags on the uniforms. Some cause for concern. Security here very tight.
The official numbers now, as far as the U.S. is concerned, 25 dead, 9 missing, 7 prisoners of war. On the British side, 20 dead and 2 missing at this hour. Shep?
Bret, I guess from seeing the videotape or hearing of it, we had an idea of this report tonight of executed prisoners, but when you hear the number 2 guy say it, it certainly is sobering.
Yeah, General Peter Pace saying tonight that he believes and has come to the conclusion that Iraqi troops executed some of those prisoners of war from that very first incident that we talked about. The supply convoy took a wrong turn, was encountered by some of those Iraqi forces. There are reports, and Pentagon officials say they are reports that are credible, that those forces, once they got out of their vehicles, were executed in public. Some of them were then executed, we're told, in the morgues that they were seen on that video shown on Al Jazeera television.
Bret Baier, live for us at the Pentagon. Bret, thanks very much. Bret's going over to Fox News Radio, and he'll be back with us at the bottom of the hour for discussion of the rest of the day's headlines in the war in Iraq. First, waves of explosions in downtown Baghdad overnight, some of them near the city center. And there's a possibility the Iraqi Information Ministry was hit. Smoke could be seen drifting near that building. Greg Palcott's been monitoring developments. He's live in our newsroom in Amman, Jordan. Greg?
Hey, Shepard, it has been 1 week since bombs went over Baghdad, and once again, Baghdad in the gun sights. As you mentioned, 30 explosions heard in the last several hours in Baghdad, including the center of the city, including the area of the television center. That was the same target that was hit last night. That knocked Iraqi television off of the air temporarily. We've been looking at Iraqi satellite television, and that is off the air. air. We have no idea if the terrestrial channels are also off the air, and no clear fix on whether the information ministry was hit. Certainly there was smoke behind the information ministry. Other bombing, mostly on the outskirts of the city where the Republican Guard is believed to be grouping. Now, this followed explosions earlier on Wednesday in Baghdad, which left as many as 15 people dead, 30 injured. Happened around midday in a crowded area, buildings, cars destroyed. The U.S. says it was targeting Iraqi missiles and missile launchers placed around residential areas, and that the destruction could have been caused by a misguided Iraqi air defense missile. For its part, the Iraqi government says absolutely not. This is all America's fault. Finally, some images from up in northern Iraq around the city of Mosul. Armed tribesmen and Ba'ath Party members pledging to defend the regime of Saddam Hussein. They're getting their anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns ready. Interestingly enough, Shepard, we were up in the Mosul area about a month ago, and we watched some of these guys go through their paces. We didn't take them too seriously. Some of them were old. Some of them were out of shape. Some of their weapons looked out of shape. But these are the same kind of paramilitary types, these same kind of militia types that have been causing so much problems for Allied forces in the south. They could do the same in the north. That's the view from Amman. Back to you, Shep.
Greg Palcott live for us this early morning in Amman. Greg, thanks very much. Iraqis are swarming trucks that were bringing in much-needed food and water. You should have seen these scenes earlier today. In fact, we'll show you some video for it. They are hurting for food and water in the south, and it's not because of anything that the coalition forces have done. It's because, according to the Pentagon and other sources close to Basra, they have shut, the Iraqi government and the Iraqi troops have shut off the water, shut down the food lines, and have shut off much of the power. Their suffering, again, is because of their own people. They needed food and water. It was donated by the Kuwaiti government. It's the first sizable shipment of humanitarian aid to make it into that country. Jonathan Hunt's been monitoring details. He's live in Kuwait City with him. Hello, Jonathan.
Hey, Shep, yeah, this huge humanitarian aid effort which President Bush promised is now finally underway. And remember, it's important to remember that within a week of the war beginning, the humanitarian aid is now arriving. There was a short delay, part of it because of pockets of Iraqi resistance across the south, part of it because of the bad weather which rolled through this region over the last 48 hours. But the convoys are now rolling. One of the first of those reached the town of Safwan, that's just across the border from Kuwait. It was greeted by hundreds of Iraqis, clearly desperate for the supplies on board. And as you can see from this, there were some fairly chaotic scenes there. Those white boxes contained a total of around 21,000 meals, bread, flour, tea and water. Another convoy has also rolled into the port city of Qasr. There are shiploads more, tons more aid waiting to come off vessels which are anchored out in the Gulf, just waiting to dock at Qasr. Now that the British troops have secured that port, putting down the last of the Iraqi resistance there, aid will begin to flow to other places in Iraq, cities like Basra, for instance. First, though, Basra itself has to be secured, and a battle is still raging there. British troops are ringing the city. They're fighting regulars, but also around 1,000 militia. And British troops fighting there tell us that it's becoming more like a terrorist campaign than conventional warfare. Now, the fighting that is going on around Basra has caused some civilians to leave that city, partly for fear for their own safety, partly because they are coming further south in search of the aid that is now reaching the southern parts of Iraq. Meantime, coalition planes flying from their bases here in Kuwait have begun pounding a column of around 120 Iraqi tanks and armoured vehicles which have been headed out of Basra, heading south. Now, they seem to be using the sandstorms that have blown through as cover for that. It's not clear whether they're simply trying to get away from the fighting and facing the British troops there, or whether they are heading further south to try to attack coalition forces there. Either way, the air raids which have been underway should prevent them achieving either of those goals. That's the latest live from Kuwait City. Shep, back to you.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Just getting word that Rick Leventhal is working to make a connection with us right now, and while we hook that up, I want to let you know that the 4th LAR, the Marines' 4th, the 4th Light Armored Reconnaissance Division, is working its way in there. You know, all their stuff was in the water on 30 to 40 ships. They weren't able to get in. They had hoped it would all come in from Turkey. Now it's coming in from the south. 4th Infantry Division. I said 4th LAR, didn't I? I think that's because Rick is with the 3rd LAR. At any rate, the 4th Armored... The fourth is coming in from the south eventually, and they'll be needed for backup. Our own Rick Leventhal has been embedded with the 1st Marine, 3rd LAR Battalion. Rick, good morning. What do you see?
It's a beautiful day, Shepard, for the first time in about, 48 to 72 hours. The sun's shining, the wind is not howling, and you'd think that we'd be off and running, but we're not, because we've got an LAV just mired in the mud. We were driving last night after dark, and it was so dark that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And these guys do have night vision goggles, but they amplify or magnify the light that exists. And if there's no light, then they don't help much. So we were creeping along, and we almost drove into a ditch. We didn't. They backed off, but another LAV passed us and went right in there. And when we woke up this morning, we saw that he had almost flipped over. They towed him out. There's another one that's stuck, and the LAV trying to pull him out got stuck, and they hooked up a 3rd LAV to pull those 2 out, and he got stuck. So now we actually have 4 LAVs in a line, all tied together with tow lines, trying to pull each other out of this mud pit.
4 what's, Rick?
LAVs, light armored vehicles.
Light armored vehicles.
One of them is a LAV-R, which stands for recovery. It has a crane on it and a winch. And that was the one that was able to pull the one that had been stuck, almost flipped over, out. But now it's just it's become a bigger mess than we imagined.
What do you hear about contact with the enemy in or around you, north or south?
Well, north of us, we hear that the contact is continuing. Sporadic gunfights as the Marines move to the north. Last evening, before dark, we passed through what had been a battlefield for the past couple of days and saw a lot of stuff we haven't seen yet. We saw 30 to 40 EPWs, enemy prisoners of war, in a pen lined with the barbed wire, the concertina wire, being guarded by Marines. We saw our first Iraqi casualties, a couple of soldiers killed, lying face down in the dirt at the side of the road. And we saw a lot of abandoned munitions, including rocket-propelled grenade launchers and grenades, and boxes and boxes of mortars and mortar shells just littering the side of the road where the Iraqis had, I guess, dropped them and fled when the forces advanced. We also saw some buildings that have been heavily damaged. And this road is apparently just crawling with Iraqis who have put up a pretty stiff resistance. The push north continues, though, and they're, I think, making more progress now than they had been over the past couple of days.
I want to show folks who weren't with us earlier tonight for the Fox Report what it is you're talking about when you mention those sandstorms and all the mud that has come after. Do we have that tape? Why don't we roll that tape?
It's Tuesday, March 25th, about 3:30 in the afternoon. We're in the middle of the worst sandstorm that we've ever seen. It's gotten progressively worse throughout the day. Early this morning, it was blowing a little bit. Visibility was several hundred meters. Then it got down to maybe 100 meters, then maybe 50, and then 20, and now it's just you can only see about a few feet in front of your face. The wind is gusting well over 50 miles an hour, perhaps 60, 70 miles per hour. The conditions are just awful. It's like you're taking a bath in dirt out here. They were firing mortars earlier today, but we haven't heard any in a while, and it's easy to understand why. You cannot see anything out here, but perhaps more incredible than the weather is the fact that a Marine can actually sleep through this. That's Carlucci down there.
That sandstorm reached hurricane-force winds, and it created quite a mess for us, especially after it turned into a thunderstorm later on. These are our kits here, and you can see they're pretty dirty. Everybody got dirty last night. We spent much of this morning cleaning up, and the weather actually improved. It looked like it was going to be a decent day, but as you can see now, it appears the sandstorms have returned, so the operational pause on the ground may last a little bit longer.
That from during the day? That from during the day on Wednesday and before, I guess, was the night before in the sandstorm. Rick, we could see you there. Why can't we see you now? Don't you have a video phone?
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but the vehicle that we're on doesn't have an inverter that we could use to power the video phone portion of our satellite phone. So that is riding with another vehicle in the supply train, or the vehicles that follow behind to resupply us with food and water, etc. Dusty the engineers back there with a satellite dish as well. But because of our mission and because of what they do and what we do, they can't ride with us, and there's no room in our vehicle for all that equipment and for him. So we have to ride separately. Whenever we get a chance, we link up with him and we feed tape and we go live with the dish. But without the power, we can't do the live shots, and it's been frustrating for me because there's so much to show, but we just don't have the ability to do it. So the phone calls are the best I can do it in most cases.
Rick, we keep hearing about how this Battle of Baghdad and the fact that it's coming and the fact that they're working to secure the cities to the south of you there, and that this thing could become urban warfare and all the rest. Is that talked about when you guys stop to camp or whatever it is?
We haven't discussed that specifically, but I think what has been discussed is that I don't think people here expect that the resistance will last much longer. I think that if the military makes the progress that it hopes to make up north, then I think that the people down south will fall in line. I don't think you're going to see what you saw in Afghanistan, for example. I think that you'll probably see people lay down their weapons and say, okay, time to stop fighting. We've got a new boss in town.
Sounds like a good plan. Rick Leventhal, be safe. Tell the folks hello.
I will
We're proud of them.
I will do that too. Thanks a lot.
All right, buddy. Thanks a lot.
And by the way, I think they're making progress getting this LAV out now. It looks like this train of vehicles towed together is now starting to get itself unstuck.
That light armored vehicle.
Exactly.
Yeah, the light armored vehicle. Rick Leventhal has become
right.
one of them.
And it is a battalion, not a division.
Okay, touche. Rick, see you soon, I hope. Coming up, Central Command showing us how good their technology can how well their technology can work. Watch this. Under the bridge. Bridge is fine. Tank is gone. All of that, plus we'll discuss this article in the Washington Post online, which says that this war could last months. Didn't say anybody said it would be fast. Just said that that's the reporting on the front page of the Washington Post. We'll discuss the reasons for that reporting and all the rest for you coming up live on Fox.
This program is brought to you by Hummer. Check out the new H2 at Hummer.com.
Excuse me. I think the fish is still alive.
Excuse me.
You have trouble sleeping when you're away from home, don't you? And you've tried everything at those hotels, using extra pillows, raiding the minibar, wearing one of those black eye masks. Nothing works. But have you tried saving money? You'd be surprised how restful getting a great price at a nice hotel can feel. For example,
check out additional hotel savings during our spring break sale.
So you can sleep soundly and save money doing it. Travelocity. Call or see site for details.
Minutes past 7 a.m. in Baghdad on what Rick Leventhal described as a beautiful day. You may be able to see some clouds in the distance. Looks a bit like smoke, but I'm told it's clouds nonetheless. The bombings over Baghdad have continued. The early morning hours will see much more of the same to the south and east of the city. The bombing raids are said to continue to the north in the region called Erbil. Explosions seen tonight. Bombs over Baghdad, as Fox reports this hour. British Prime Minister Tony Blair meeting with President Bush at Camp David tonight. This ahead of the Prime Minister's get-together in New York City tomorrow with the UN's Kofi Annan. White House correspondent Wendell Goler live on the North Lawn with details now. Wendell?
Shepard, logic would make the Camp David summit a council of war, but Prime Minister Blair says he's actually here as a peacemaker. He's looking for a way to get the U.S. and Europe to work together again as partners instead of rivals. And with the Washington Post, as you point out, saying experts are predicting the war could go on for months, the President and Prime Minister are actually looking beyond the war to Iraq's rebuilding. Prime Minister Blair once again trying to make peace on the United Nations Security Council. The same council members the U.S. and U.K. bumped heads with earlier this month now don't want to authorize a UN role in rebuilding Iraq because they feel that would legitimize the war they opposed. Once again, France is leading the way, which made for some entertaining comments at a House committee hearing today.
I share with Mr. Rogers my concern about money for Turkey. I think that'll be a hard sell, but I can understand. Is there any money in there for France?
No.
I just wondered.
President began the day with a briefing on the progress of the war at MacDill Air Base near Tampa. It's the home of the Central Command where the battle plans were drawn up. And Mr. Bush was linked by video phone with General Tommy Franks, who was directing the fight from the Persian Gulf. Later, he had lunch with the troops, told them coalition forces are making great progress in Iraq, but said the war is far from over, and Saddam Hussein's launching the most desperate elements of his army, waiting for the troops as they close in on Baghdad. The President aimed to raise the morale of the airmen and women and to boost the resolve of the American people by asserting once again the fight over there is part of the war against terror here.
We will not wait to meet this danger with firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our own cities. Instead, we are meeting the danger today with our Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, and Marines.
Even though the president says the war is far from over, his aides say coalition forces are actually ahead of schedule, which makes post-war planning quite important. Prime Minister Blair trying to get the U.S. to give the UN a bigger role in post-war Iraq than it really wants, trying to get France, Germany, and Russia to swallow their pride about a war they couldn't prevent, and which the U.S., at least in part, blames on their refusal to enforce the UN Security Council resolutions. He and the president will hold meetings tomorrow before and after an 11 o'clock news conference that Fox News Channel will carry live. Shepard?
Wendell Goler live at the White House, where they've clearly turned the lights off for the evening. Good call. Wendell, thank you. Imagine the sight in the skies, if you can. For the first time in decades, 1,000 troops dropping into Iraq, opening up the northern front on Saddam Hussein. For the first time, that many, the first time in decades. Here with more on that mobilization and what it may mean to the war effort ahead, Martin Strong, retired Navy SEAL and veteran of some 30 special ops missions. Great to see you again. Thanks.
Hi, Shep.
Talk about improvising a northern front. They figured it out pretty darn quick, didn't they?
Well, I think General Franks was going to use his airborne troops and the Rangers as kind of a floating reserve that he could apply anywhere on the battlefield, and the Turks changed the schedule a little bit, so now they're probably going to be split between the reserve duty to be applied on the Battle of Baghdad and establishing that northern front.
How difficult is it to get 1,000 paratroopers into a hostile territory?
Well, as long as there aren't people on the ground shooting up at you like in, say, Panama or in World War II, it's the same problems you would run in if you were trying to jump at Fort Bragg or Fort Benning in the United States. It's jumping out of the plane and trying to get everybody together on the ground and get a head count.
Some people are writing saying, well, how do they get their stuff? How do they have the tools that they need?
Well, when you do a combat jump, you're going to have your equipment suspended right across your knees, and about 20 feet above the ground, you release a quick release, which deploys that gear below you about 15 feet on a tether. It'll hit the ground first, and then you'll hit the ground a little bit distance from it, so it's attached to you.
This is CENTCOM video, and this is from the 25th, so it's not what happened today, but it certainly gives a relatively good idea of what it was like. I'm guessing that this large a drop has to be practiced pretty often, yes?
It does. It's a little bit of choreographed madness. The especially at night. But when I first went through airborne school, and to get my first 5 jumps to qualify before going to a SEAL team, we had to do night jumps as the very prerequisite to get those jump wings. So these paratroopers have been doing this for a long time.
101st.
101st, 82nd, all the special ops guys, they're all capable of doing what you just saw.
And they're all going to move from the north to the south and be part of this circle around Baghdad, I suppose?
Well, I would guess they're going to augment that 70,000-man Kurdish army and put pressure and maybe cause Saddam to shift some forces towards the northern front. I'd still be watching for the rest of the airborne and ranger forces to be used as a mobile reserve when General Franks sees what the deployment is of these Iraqi divisions in the south.
Do you ever look at the situation with the Kurds and the Turks and think, man, this could get messy?
It could get messy. I don't think the Kurds are going to do this when we're around, not during the early phases, but if we put some, you know, another government, Iraqi government of dissidents or temporary UN observation in charge of Iraq, you could see some problems maybe 6-7 months after that.
When you see an operation dropping in like this, knowing that there was supposed to be a northern front, do you have concerns, or do you say, well, this was the second plan and we're on plan?
Well, this was probably a plan for any front that they needed to throw in there using airborne troops. I think the fact that we couldn't bring the mechanized infantry through Turkey forced our hand in you know, committing some of the airborne troops to a northern front. But I believe that General Franks had this in his back pocket from the very beginning. You haven't heard from the Rangers and the airborne forces all through this so far, and I think he's going to throw them where they're best going to be used.
Indeed. Once a Navy SEAL, always a Navy SEAL. Martin Strong with us. Good to see you, Martin.
Thanks, Shep.
All right, coming up, hungry and thirsty Iraqis swarming trucks carrying food and water, courtesy of the Kuwaiti government. The commander-in-chief saying the day of reckoning for Saddam Hussein's regime is near. The president visiting the U.S. Central Command near Tampa, Florida. Pictures from the front lines, fighting the elements as they fight the enemy. Would you look at that picture? A mean Marine dealing with a severe sandstorm at Camp Viper in the Iraqi desert. More on Operation Iraqi Freedom and details of this report from WashingtonPost.com. Months for the war. Who's exactly surprised by this? Who said it was going to be quick? And why might it take months? Analysis and your emails as Fox reports this out.
It was not my dream to realize this day. The day a father watched his daughter start at Juilliard. But I embraced that dream with unwavering attention and made it my own, because that was the dream of my client.